Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. We start this time with some updates on voter suppression, and I expect there'll be a few more between now and Election Day, and maybe even after. I think I said last time that I could not begin to catalog all the efforts being made in states across the country to block, limit, purge, and intimidate voters. But I do want to note a few more. First, quickly, because I suspect you've heard about this, the Goppers are spending $20 million to recruit 50,000 volunteers in 15 states to observe polling places on Election Day, with the expected targets being, of course, minority districts. They're taking advantage of the fact that the courts allowed a consent decree which banned voter intimidation at the polls to expire in 2018. But next, we've got Republican Senator Rick Scott, known to us around here as Voldemort. Scott has introduced legislation that would have the effect of having millions of mail-in votes just never be counted. Under the proposal, counting of mail-in ballots could not start until the morning of Election Day and must be finished by within 24 hours of the time the polls close. Any state laws to the contrary would be preempted. What that means is mail-in ballots, all of them, would have to be counted within one roughly 36-hour window, and any that are not counted in that time would simply be discarded as having arrived too late. Now, the bill won't pass, at least because it won't go through the House, but it does show the lengths to which the Goppers will go in their attempts to attack voting. Meanwhile, telegraphing the actual Gopper plan, Lindsey Graham insists that the Goppers will allow for a peaceful transition of power, which he defined as accepting whatever decision the Supreme Court makes about the election. The voters apparently be damned. That's why, in fact, he insisted we just have to rush through to get Amy Bugs Bunny Barrett on the Supreme Court because we can't allow for a 4-4 tie. In which case makes me wonder which of the reactionaries currently on the court people like Graham Cracker are worried about holding. Because they may not have to worry, because considering that in July, that same reactionary majority approved of what amounts to a poll tax, which is supposedly banned by the Constitution. See, in 2018, Florida voters approved a measure, an amendment to the state constitution, giving convicted felons who had done their time, gave them back their right to vote. The right-wing legislature in Florida immediately set about undermining the will of the voters by requiring that ex-felons also have repaid all fines and fees, even though the state imposes like a mind-boggling array of fees on defendants, to the point where when this case was at trial level, it was revealed that the state actually has no idea how much these people owe. So in other words, it's pay up or don't vote, which is a poll tax by any reasonable definition, even if you want to pay, we actually can't tell you how much you owe or for what. Now, the trial judge blocked this measure, only to be overturned by the right-wing 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which allowed this poll tax to go into effect. The Supreme Court then refused to hear an appeal of that decision, which in effect says, yeah, sure, that's cool with us, go ahead. Meanwhile, you know, I'm sure, about the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service, but in late September, documents released in a court case revealed that despite their repeated lies about it, it was actually top executives at the Postal Service who were instrumental in pushing strategies that delayed mail delivery. And this delay is coming at a time when everybody was expecting an unprecedented number of mail-in votes. Mail delays which could cause unknown thousands of those votes to arrive too late to be counted. On October 1st, Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order that drop-off balloting boxes must be located, or limited rather, to one per county in the state, despite the enormous population differences between counties, and despite the fact that Harris County, the state's most populous and a major Democratic stronghold, has an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. And in fact, scratch where I said despite this and that, and substitute because of this and that. Next, for at least 40 years, it has been policy at the Department of Injustice to make no announcements and take no public actions close to an election if the surrounding publicity could potentially affect the outcome. On October 2nd, that was changed. Now, if a U.S. Attorney's Office suspects election fraud, investigators will be allowed to take public actions before the polls close, even if those actions do risk affecting the outcome. Singled out in this announcement were cases involving postal workers and military employees. In other words, the very people most likely to be involved in mail-in voting. Last on this, at least for now, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, the Goppers there, are proposing a new Gopper-dominated special committee, quote, to investigate, review, and make recommendations concerning the regulation and conduct of the 2020 general election, with powers including being able to subpoena witnesses and documents, including, it would seem, as yet uncounted ballots, and with the goal of recommending legislation even before the election. Now, on the other hand, I do have to say that not all the news is bad. In fact, there is some good news to be had on this. First, there's Montana, where in August, Governor Steve Bullock issued a directive allowing counties in the state to adopt or accept mail-in voting if they chose for the 2020 elections. The Trump campaign, the Republican National Committee, and the Montana Republican State Central Committee filed suits looking to block mail-in voting in the state. On September 30th, U.S. District Judge Dana Christensen dismissed the suit in its entirety, calling claims about widespread fraud in the 2020 election, quote, fiction, unquote. Also in August, also in Nevada, the state passed legislation sending mail-in ballots to all registered voters. The Tweety Pie campaign, of course, sued and lost. On September 21st, U.S. District Judge James Mahan dismissed the case, saying the Trump campaign does not represent Nevada voters, does not have standing to bring the suit, and in fact, he called the suit impermissibly generalized. Meanwhile, also in Nevada, another group of right-wing vote haters sued in state court over the same legislation and also lost. On October 7th, the state Supreme Court unanimously dismissed the suit, saying the Goppers had not presented substantial evidence that the parts of law being challenged, quote, are not rationally related to the state's interest in ensuring that all active registered voters have an opportunity to exercise their right to vote in a safe and secure manner during a pandemic, and also that the Goppers had presented no concrete evidence that fraud would actually occur. In New Jersey, on October 6th, U.S. District Judge Michael Shipp rejected the attempt by the Trump campaign to block a plan approved by state lawmakers, allowing election officials to begin counting mailed ballots 10 days before Election Day and to accept mailed ballots up to 2 days after November 3rd, even if they lacked a postmark. Now, Shipp noted that there had been real allegations of voter fraud in New Jersey in previous elections, but none of them had anything to do with the issues at hand in this case. Now we go back to Pennsylvania, where Philadelphia recently opened 7 satellite election offices deemed legal by the state Supreme Court, where people can register to vote, apply for a mail-in ballot, or if they chose, get it and fill it out and turn it in right there. Trump campaign employees promptly showed up at these offices demanding that they be allowed to go in and watch what people were doing. City election officials prevented them, and the campaign, of course, sued. On October 9th, Judge Gary Glazer threw them out of court, finding that Pennsylvania law does not allow such representatives to observe in election offices. Also, again, in Pennsylvania, which you're starting to get an indication of how important Pennsylvania is in this election. In Pennsylvania, again, the Tweety Pie campaign and the Republican National Committee sued to block the state from having ballot drop boxes, to force the state to do signature matches between voter registration records and the ballots, and to pave the way for bringing in an army of non-resident poll watchers to intimidate voters. They lost on all three counts. In an opinion issued on October 10th, U.S. District Judge Nicholas Ranjan wrote that, quote, while plaintiffs may not need to prove actual voter fraud, they must at least prove that such fraud is impending. They haven't met that burden. At most, they have pieced together a sequence of uncertain assumptions. Now, all that is good news. All that is good news about the right to vote. But you have to realize that all of these decisions, with the possible exception of the Nevada State Supreme Court one, are subject to appeal, which means it's possible in each of those cases for the good news to suddenly turn bad. But unless it is done for consciously partisan and ideological reasons, which you have to admit is a real possibility, unless for those reasons, it's unlikely any court would overturn any one of these decisions just 3 weeks short of Election Day. But even if all this good news remains good, it still illustrates what has been going on. It is all part of, it's the legal face of, a coordinated multi-million-dollar, multi-state campaign to block, hinder, and undermine access to voting for tens of millions of people. These suits are not separate from voter ID laws, not separate from voter purges, not separate from daily screeching about non-existent fraud, not separate from the deliberate creation of hours-long lines, such as this one from the first day of early voting in Georgia. They are all one and the same. They are a campaign of deception, intimidation, lies, and deceit, and intended to denigrate and delegitimize voting, and through that undermine the concept of a self-government that could challenge the political and economic elites of our society. Oh, and finally on this for now, 2 relevant footnotes. First, there has been indeed voter fraud occurring in this year's election, and it's coming from, yeah, you know where. California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, the state's top election official, has announced that his office is investigating reports that the state's Republican Party has set up illegal ballot drop boxes in several major counties. Only county election officials can set up ballot drop boxes. These phony ones could be a felony. And second footnote, we need to remember that goppers aren't the only ones whose declared devotion to free and open elections depends on what is to their benefit. So here's a reminder. Again, we go to Pennsylvania, where on September 17th, in response to a suit filed by a couple of connected Democrats, the state Supreme Court kicked the Green Party off the presidential ballot. Why? Well, Pennsylvania state law requires that third parties submit 5,000 signatures to appear on the ballot, together with an affidavit of candidacy. The Greens substituted their paperwork by hand in August, but they faxed the official affidavit, the final affidavit rather, so it was not turned in together with the signatures. Now, this seems like a remarkably trivial error, particularly since no one is disputing that the party gathered enough signatures, but it was enough to enable the Dems to get the party kicked off the ballot entirely with no opportunity to correct the error. All right, enough on that for now, for this episode. Instead, we're going to move on to our regular feature, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns, and outrages. And we start, as we usually do, with the clowns. Okay, so Tweety Pie engages in a pattern of risky behavior, such as packed campaign rallies and indoor events across the country, or refusing to wear a mask, and winds up catching COVID-19. There is lots of commentary, but it took Representative Matt Gaetz, seen here practicing for the right wing's annual Smuggest Man Alive competition. It took him to see the real meaning of Tweety Pie catching COVID, which is that it means that the protection guidelines put forth by the CDC, the ones Tweety Pie persistently ignored, those protection guidelines don't work. What I can tell you, he told Tucker Carlson on October 2nd, is that if this virus can get into the Oval, into the body of the president, there is no place where it could not possibly infect one of our fellow Americans. And therefore, we should just go ahead and open everything up and let the disease run rampant because precautions are useless, and I guess we all got to get sick and die sometime. Matt Gaetz, ghoulish clown. Speaking of Tucker Carlson, on the same day as that, he equated criticizing Tweety Pie's behavior in contracting COVID with blaming the victim of a sexual assault. Carlson claimed that the media and the Democrats' view was that Tweety Pie deserved what he got and that their perspective on Trump was, quoting Tux, he asked for it, he was dressed provocatively. I guess then in Tuck's mind, if a drunk driver killed someone, you can actually criticize them for getting behind the wheel drunk because that would be the same as blaming a rape victim for her rape. Tux is an old hand at winning clown awards. Nice to see he hasn't lost his touch. Someone who used to be on top but has fallen by the wayside in the presence of clowns more powerful than her is Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee. But while she has dropped from the top tier, she still has her moments, as on October 5th, when in response to Tweety Pie leaving the hospital, she tweeted, "President Trump has once again defeated China. Welcome home." There's really nothing to say except Marsha Blackburn, once a clown, always a clown. But our winner this time easily outclassed the field. It simply was no contest. The winner of this time's Clown Award is Bill Maher, the most undeservedly self-important man in television. On his September 23rd show, he took time out from his usual self-indulgent pontificating to finger exactly who is responsible for everything bad that has happened for the last 4 years and everything bad that will happen under an even more right-wing Supreme Court. Because just one group is responsible for all of it. Who are they? People who voted for Jill Stein in 2016. That's right, it's all the people who voted for the Green Party. Was it the fault of Hillary Clinton, who ran a crappy campaign based almost entirely around I'm not Trump, who didn't campaign at all in Wisconsin and did worse among blacks, Latinos, Asians, and the young than Barack Obama did just 4 years earlier? No, it was Jill Stein voters. Was it the fault of those black, Latino, Asian, and young voters who either switched parties or stayed home? Nope, it was the fault of Jill Stein voters. Was it the fault of James Comey, who, it was all but universally agreed, threw a monkey wrench into the Clinton campaign with his last-minute announcement of a reopened investigation, an investigation which, by the way, went nowhere? Nope, it was Jill Stein voters. Was it the fault of the media and the Democratic Party establishment who, after the election, did their best to normalize Trump until they could no longer deny the reality? No, it was Jill Stein voters. This is all based on the not moth-eaten, but yet is dung-encrusted nonsense that if only, oh Lord, if only all of Jill Stein's voters had actually voted for Hillary Clinton instead, oh, what a wonderful world this would be. Because in 3 key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Stein's vote total exceeded the difference between Clinton and Tweety Pie. Except there are 2 things wrong here. One is that it turned out when all the votes were counted that Stein's vote in Pennsylvania did not exceed the margin between Clinton and Tweety Pie. And even if Clinton had won Michigan and Wisconsin but still lost Pennsylvania, she still would have lost the election. And 2, exit polls found that if Stein had not been on the ballot, some of her voters might have voted for Tweety Pie, and half or maybe more wouldn't have voted at all. Which means if the Green Party wasn't on the ballot at all, the only difference it would have made in the election is that the Democrats would have had one fewer excuse, one fewer target to blame, one fewer way to avoid blaming anyone other than themselves for their own screw-ups. Oh, and one final thing on this. You really want to know who's to blame for Tweety Pie? How about the 42% of eligible voters who did not vote in that election? Why were the Democrats incapable of moving any of that group? If they had been able to rouse just 1/10 of those voters, 1/10 of those non-voters, they would have added more votes to their total than all third-party candidates combined, and they utterly failed. Now, the truth is, I don't know how it could be, but I'm sure that in light of this, Bill Maher will find some way to tell us that, no, that was the fault of Jill Stein voters. Bill Maher, truly a clown, and I'm taking a break. And we are back. All right, now we move on to the outrages, and we have two this time. First, two former health officials have revealed that back in March, Vice President Mike Not Worth a Farthing ordered CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield to use the agency's emergency powers to effectively seal the U.S. borders. In doing so, they're overruling agency scientists who said there is no valid public health reason to issue such an order, and no evidence that the action would slow the spread of the coronavirus, which it hasn't. Dr. Redfield, showing the spunk and spine for which he's become so notable, immediately capitulated and told his top officials, get it done. Until then, public health experts had urged the administration to focus on a national mask mandate to enforce social distancing and to increase the number of contact tracers to track down people exposed to the virus. But now the hammer came down and the message was, screw all that, seal the borders. Why? Well, you can see it easily this way. Because while the CDC's order affected the border with Canada, it has mostly affected the thousands of asylum seekers and immigrants at the U.S. border with Mexico. That is, this had nothing to do with public health and everything to do with blocking immigration. Indeed, the chief proponent of closing the borders was Stephen Miller, a top Tweety Pie aide and a notorious xenophobic bigot, who knew the order could be used to kick asylum seekers and other immigrants out of the country with no due process. And it has done exactly that. Since the order went into effect on March 20th, nearly 150,000 people, including at least 8,800 unaccompanied minors who usually are afforded special protection under federal law, nearly 150,000 people have been sent back to their countries of origin with no due process. Many have been returned to dangerous and violent conditions in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Lee Gelernt, Deputy Director of the American Civil Liberties Union Immigrants' Rights Project, declared that, quoting him, "This is what the Trump administration has been trying to do for 4 years, and I finally saw a window." A window they are, in fact, keeping open. Although it was supposed to be a temporary one-month measure, the order has been renewed multiple times. And the administration, of course, lied about this, claiming it was all about protecting Customs and Borders Patrol agents. As Not Worth a Farthing claimed he had nothing to do with it, and Tweety Pie claimed that the order had originated from within the CDC. Now, Dr. Josh Sharfstein, a former FDA deputy commissioner and a Johns Hopkins professor, said of Redfield, "I don't know how we could look another CDC scientist in the eye after this." Hell, I don't know anyone in that administration who could look any honest person in the eye, but they do, because they are a cabal of moral monsters and craven-crawling cowards. They are collectively an outrage. Another outrage, or other outrage this time out, is a repeat offender. It's our mainstream news media, by which we are malinformed, misinformed, and uninformed. Now understand, this is not the product, this result is not the product of some conspiracy. The media does not have weekly phone calls where they get together to decide what will be covered and how. It is rather the product of a common mindset, a common, almost universal way of thinking that leads to groupthink, to so-called pack journalism, where everybody winds up covering the same story because everybody else is covering the same story. It's a mindset that favors the powerful over the weak favors official sources over unofficial ones, one that makes journalists jealous of protecting their access, which becomes all important to them, and one that never forgets that they are in a business and that drama makes for ratings. If it bleeds, it leads is not obsolete guidance. That last point leads to examples like this one. After a grand jury declined to indict 3 cops in the death of Breonna Taylor, protests broke out in Louisville. One of those days, one of those nights, 28 people were arrested, at least some of them, as soon as a 9 p.m. curfew went into effect, apparently just for, straight up violating curfew. Now, I'm quoting here from an ABC News report on this. Just before curfew started, orders were given for protesters to clear out of a park downtown. Many protesters left, but a group sought sanctuary in a nearby Unitarian church. Just before midnight, according to police, a small group of people left the church and began causing destruction in the area. Some windows at nearby schools were broken. One car was set on fire with an incendiary device. Okay, that's the story. You got that? A crowd was in the park. Most left when the curfew came. Around midnight, a small group began causing trouble. Okay. This is how that article was headlined, and I'm quoting here. 28 arrests made during Breonna Taylor protests in Louisville. Windows smashed, vehicles set ablaze. Police say the arrest followed a wave of destruction in the city. Now, does that headline, which is what most people see and many do not read beyond, does that headline reflect the story? No, it doesn't. It ignores the peaceful many in order to emphasize and sensationalize the violence by a small number, turning a small group of people who broke some windows and set one car on fire into a wave of destruction. Compare that kind of sensationalism with the pretty much ho-hum reaction to Tweety Pie's September 3rd refusal to commit to a peaceful transfer of power and suggestion that any election which he lost was by definition too corrupt to accept. That was treated like, well, it's an interesting story, I suppose, but we can't get worked up over it. It got nothing like the wave of destruction treatment that some vandalism got in the Breonna Taylor case. The New York Times, for example, pretty much buried the story. Peter Baker, the paper's chief White House correspondent, tried to explain that away by citing print publication deadlines, but that seemed to be an issue when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died late in the evening, and yet the very next day, the Times had a page 1 above the fold feature on it. Meanwhile, the evening's network newscast on ABC, CBS, and NBC, on the evening newscast on the day that Tweety Pie made his remarkable statement, they didn't even cover it. They didn't even mention it, the fact that Tweety Pie had in effect threatened to refuse to leave office if he lost the election. It just wasn't important enough to them. There was, in fact, some decades ago, a sort of golden age in journalism, with print newspapers were plentiful and radio and TV news was not expected to make a profit for their owners. But those days are long dead. Their death notices signed when those corporations realized that, yes, news can be a profit center, and we continue to suffer the effects of that. Make no mistake, there is still quality journalism and original reporting out there. The New York Times reporting on Tweety's taxes is actually a recent example. But we should not and cannot content ourselves with celebrating the outliers. An informed populace is more important than ever now. And on that account, our major media, too focused on profit and too addicted to power, continues to fail us. And that is an outrage. And I am out of time, so I am going to get out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, have the best couple of weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.